Welcome, everybody. Thank you, Bridget, for having me. Sorry I couldn't be there today in person. I'm going to talk through today some things to think about when you have a child with a disability. Some of this, I don't know where you are in your lives, so some of this you may have already done. Other other things should be on your radar coming forward. So the first thing I wanted, and all these slides are available. Bridget should be able to share these with everybody. But the what I have here is a timeline. So it starts with getting the diagnosis, figuring out what you should be doing, what your next steps are, what resources are out there, like the NR2F1 Foundation, and then just really moving into elementary, middle, high school, and post-high school, and not looking too far ahead, because if you look too far ahead, sometimes you can get overwhelmed and then what's called analysis paralysis, just not take any action at all. So this timeline is just kind of an idea of what's coming down the road. As I go through this, I would rather give you, I'm going to do my best to give you concrete examples of resources you can use that are available in every state. I'm not going to focus on any one particular state, but I really want to make sure you know about resources that are available no matter where you are in the country. So, the first thing many of you have already done, I'm sure, since you're here at the NR2F1 Foundation's meeting, is you've connected with resources. So I want to focus more on what may be available in your state that you haven't looked into yet. Many states have what's called a Katie Beckett waiver. It's a waiver that's available for children under the age of 18. It's paid for by Medicaid, and it does not take into account how much money a family has. So very often when you hear parents say they applied for SSI or they applied for Medicaid and they couldn't get it for their child because they make too much money, that's very true for supplemental security income. But things like the Katie Beckett waiver and other children waivers that states have, it doesn't matter how much money a parent has or parents have. And what those waivers can pay for, they can pay for therapies, they can cover respite for families. Respite is when somebody comes in to watch your child for you and lets you get a couple hours away. It can be challenging sometimes, even with respite, to find qualified caregivers. So I don't want to put out any false hope out there, but there is, it is available. It's something that can be used to pay for having a caregiver come in. Some states are still paying parents to be paid caregivers of their children. It's less common than it is if you have an adult child with a disability, but there are states out there that are allowing parents of children under the age of 18 who are providing care, in particular skilled nursing care, or if the child has complicated medical needs, and the parent can't work and is there to take care of the child, it's worth asking if the state will pay you to be their caregiver. It's not in every state, unfortunately, but it is something that many parents don't know about, so never ask about. The way you would find that is I'm going to send Bridget's going to send me a list of the states for all the conference attendees, and I built roadmaps for all 50 states in DC. So rather than have you guys try to guess where to go to find these resources, my roadmaps are designed to give you a simple way to click on a link. It'll take you to the state website that talks about the waiver if it's available in your state. And then from there, it'll have instructions for how to apply. So I don't want you trying to guess. You're going to have the tool after the conference to where you can go and apply if it's available in your state, and you also know if it's available in your state. When we talk about financial planning, I'm personally not talking about having you go out and hiring a financial planner and spending a couple $1,000s. So I used to be a financial planner, and I would charge $3,000 to $5,000 per person to do a financial plan, and then those same families would have to go to an attorney and spend another $3,000 to $5,000 to get a estate plan for a will, power of attorney, and a special needs trust. Instead, what I want you to think about is how does your child's diagnosis change what you're going to have to pay out of pocket? Many of us, when we have children, we're expecting things like maybe paying for soccer or camp or something like that. We're not expecting to pay for speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, things like that, that insurance may cover, but they may not, or they'll only cover so many hours. And if your child's not in school yet, you don't have the state paying for anything because you can't add it to an IEP. So it's what is that going to do to your budget? What are you coming out of pocket for? And are you making sure you're keeping track of those expenses? Because you can claim those expenses when you file for taxes if you itemize, and then you can keep track. If you get above, I think it's 7.5% of your income, then you can deduct it from your taxes if you're itemizing. Even conferences like this or other medical conferences, if you pay anything out of pocket for the conference, you can keep track of that spending. If you're taking your child to like Children's Medical Hospital or any other medical facilities, or if they have a lot of medical appointments, keeping track of those medical bills. That's the kind of thing I want you to think about when I say financial planning is, okay, what are we spending? How do we keep track of it? And at the end of the year, is this something that we can use to maybe get some money back from our taxes? And it's in the way I do that is I just save everything on Google Drive because it's very simple for me and it's cheap, free. So I take pictures of things and I upload it to Google Drive. And it doesn't always apply, but there have been a couple of years where my son's had more surgeries or what have you, and I've been able to take that medical deduction. So that's what when you're talking about financial planning, when you just found out you have a child with a disability, I'm really asking you to think about what new expenses might we have, what types of things should we be looking at when we come up for our health insurance. Maybe we had a high deductible health care plan before. Do we still want to have that? Is that still the right thing to have, or should we be maybe changing what the deductible is if we know we're going to be doing more medical if we think we might be doing more medical appointments? Sometimes it's hard to tell right away just how much you're going to be spending on medical appointments. So, picking that health insurance plan can be difficult. Going back to what I was saying earlier about the Medicaid waiver, if you can get your child on a Medicaid waiver in your state, then the other thing you're going to want to look at is, does my state offer a Medicaid health insurance premium program? Meaning, will my state pay for my employer-sponsored health insurance because my child's on Medicaid? And that's another thing many parents don't look into. So if you have a child, you got a diagnosis, and then you get them on Medicaid and a Medicaid waiver, and let's say you're paying $500 or $600 a month for health insurance, depending on where you live, you may be able to have the state pay that health insurance for you or take some of the costs off of your plate. So that's the kind of, again, I'm trying to give you a big picture overview of what financial planning could look like when you get that diagnosis. It's not necessarily, although it could be, but it's not necessarily sitting down with a financial planner and saying, this is what I want my retirement to look like. This is how much I want to set aside for college. It's really, I want it to be more practical of, okay, we probably need to change our health insurance because we're going to have a lot more co-pays coming out of our, coming out. We don't want our deductible to be too high because we don't want to bankrupt ourselves before the insurance starts kicking in. We want to make sure we get a really good health insurance plan that covers the medications our children might need. Those are the kinds of more pragmatic things that I would like you thinking about with regards to the financial planning. I'd also like you to think about, it's not sexy, it's not fun, but life insurance and disability insurance. Now, if you're working for an employer that offers disability insurance, I'd really encourage you to take that or see if they offer it. That's what that will typically do is it will typically cover 60% of your income and it'll be taxed. So if you make, for simple math, if you make $100,000 a year, what they'll do is they'll cover $60,000 of that, and then they'll take taxes out of whatever benefit you get. So you might get $45,000 coming to you in the form of disability insurance if you get sick or injured and you can't work anymore, or you can't work for a period of time. It's better than nothing. If you don't have that through work, or if you're self-employed, you can also find that from insurance brokers or insurance agents. And the difference with whatever you pay for out of your pocket is you wouldn't have that benefit that comes to you wouldn't be taxed. So if you get a $60,000 benefit, you would get the full $60,000 to you. Nothing would be taken out in taxes. It would all be in your pocket. And I bring that up because it's something I think many people don't think about. I've had cancer twice, so I'm a little more self-conscious of stuff like that. And it's thankfully hasn't knocked me out of the ball game too much. It definitely laid me out for a little while, but obviously I'm able to keep working. But it could have just easily prevented me from working. So it's something I'm very conscious about. I'm also very conscious about life insurance. I was widowed back in 2012. Back then, my wife and I had not done any planning. I was active duty military, and all the planning we had done would be, what if I died while I was on active duty? What would happen to her and what would happen to my son? She was a full-time caregiver for my son. He was 12 when she died. He's got some disabilities. He has staff now. He's got staff that's here about 12, 13 hours a day, Monday through Friday. But back then, we didn't have any of this in place. We hadn't done any of the planning, which is what led me to where I'm doing now. And because we didn't have life insurance, I was renting a house in Maryland, and I own a house. Well, back then I owned a house in Connecticut, and I couldn't pay the house in Connecticut off. And I ended up carrying that mortgage for about a year until I could sell it, because I was just in no, I didn't have the right frame of mind to get up there and clean it out or get it on the market or anything. And when I finally did sell it, I basically sold it for whatever I owed on the mortgage. I didn't get anything out of it. And if I'd had life insurance, I could have had a bit of a buffer to maybe hire somebody to help me take care of the house, maybe pay off the mortgage, turn it into a rental property. Who knows what it could have done? It would have just given me more options. So I would encourage you, when you find out you have a child with a disability, especially if you're, a single parent, or even if you're a two-family household, very often, at least in my experience, one of those parents isn't working. And what you don't want to happen is have a parent who passes, and then the other parent is responsible for everything, because it becomes very hard for either parent to work and be a full-time caregiver. It's very, very difficult, at least, again, speaking from personal experience. So having a life insurance policy in place can help bridge that gap. And that would be income for you, not your child. We'll talk about setting money aside for your child later on. This is really to help you in the event that something significant happens. It can be term insurance. It doesn't have to be whole life, at least for this purpose. You just want something that will cover your partner and help out should you not be able to work for a little while you get your feet under you. And then you're here to learn about special needs trust and estate planning. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm sure you go to other webinars and you hear about this a lot. I've seen a lot of articles out there about special needs trusts and estate planning. So I'm going to just real briefly touch on what a special needs trust is and what the types are, and what I think of when I tell people they should do some estate planning. I'm not an attorney. I retired from the Navy in 2012. I was a financial planner for quite a few years. And then after my first cancer diagnosis and recovery, I left financial services and went into 100% full-time disability planning, which is what I'm doing now, helping parents and individuals with disabilities map out what's available to them and connect with those resources. So when I talk about estate planning, what I'm talking about is the durable power of attorney, and I say durable power of attorney instead of just plain old power of attorney, because a durable power of attorney will stay in effect if you lose your mental faculties. That could be because you get in a car accident and you have a traumatic brain injury. It could be because maybe your parents are getting older and they start dementia, or they have other lapses, Parkinson's, or anything else that might affect their mental capacity. If you have a power of attorney without the word durable in front of it, when you lose the mental capacity, that power of attorney loses all effect. You can't do anything with it. If you have a durable power of attorney, it stays in effect even if you lose capacity. So let's say you're caring for your mom or dad, or your dad or mom lists you as their durable power of attorney for financial matters. Well, that means that, let's say they do experience dementia and they lose their capacity. That means you can serve as their financial proxy. You can pay their bills. You can negotiate their bills on their behalf. You may be able to sell their property, their house, if that's what they wanted. You can do all of that. And you want to make sure you have that for you as well. If something happens to you, you want to make sure somebody can do that on your behalf. If you have minor children, you're going to want to make sure you have people identified who are willing to step up and be their guardians. And that means take them in until they turn 18. Another example of where you need to plan for this is, when my wife was alive, our plan was to have my brother-in-law take my son should anything happen to both my wife and I. And at my wife's funeral, or shortly thereafter, my brother-in-law took me aside and told me he didn't feel he was capable of taking care of my son should something happen. So, listing him as my son's guardian would have been useless, because he wouldn't have been willing to step up, as it were. And I wish I'd known that ahead of time. Thankfully, nothing happened to me. But if you're going to be listing somebody as a guardian for a minor child with disabilities, you want to make sure that person is okay with it and understands what's going to be asked of them. So it can be some difficult conversations, but those conversations need to be had. When we start getting into the trusts, the special needs trusts, there's two kinds. You'll hear, I think when you hear special needs trust, what most people are talking about is what's called a third-party supplemental needs trust. And that means it supplements any benefits that the individual with disabilities is going to receive from social safety nets, like supplemental security income, Medicaid, things like that. To have a third-party special needs trust, it has to be what's called irrevocable, meaning you can't change it. And the beneficiary can't have any control over the money. So it's going to need a trustee. The money that goes into a special needs trust, the third party, is going to be anybody's money except for the individual with disability. So if you have a minor child with disabilities, they probably don't own anything. So there's no concern about them putting any money in. Where the concern comes from is grandma and grandpa. If they leave money to Susie, let's say this little girl who's 10 years old, her name's Susie. If grandma and grandpa leave the money to Susie directly, and Susie has disabilities, that money can't go to a third-party trust because it went to Susie, and Susie can't put any of her own money into a third-party trust. But if grandpa and grandpa say, oh, hey, I really want to help my granddaughter out, and you say, well, we've got this third-party special needs trust set up, you can put the money in that. then they can, because it never went to Susie first. I'm hoping that makes sense. The um, the good thing about supplemental needs trusts is they can pretty much be used for anything and everything. There is some risk that if the money from a third-party special needs trust is used to cover rent or housing costs, then somebody's supplemental security income could be reduced by up to a third for what's called in-kind support and maintenance. But I'll get into that a little further in the presentation. It's not a huge deal. It's so a special needs trust is a very, very good tool to have. And you don't necessarily need to work with an attorney to set one up. There's other options, and I'll get into that after I talk about what the first party trust is. So third party is anybody's money except for the individual with a disability. A first party special needs trust is the exact opposite. So if the third party is everybody except for the individual with the disability, the first party is only the individual with the disability's money. And that is called a self-settled special needs trust. What's special or what's unique about the first party special needs trust is it has a Medicaid payback provision in it. That means that any money that remains in the first party special needs trust after the individual with the disability dies can be taken back by the state that was serving the individual with disabilities to pay back whatever Medicaid paid for while the individual is alive. So in my son's case, again, I use my personal example because it's just easier than making something up off the fly. In my son's case, his Medicaid waiver for his budget, so the services he gets every year, is about $250,000 a year. And that pays for his staff and all the supports he gets from the state. When he dies, let's say this goes on for simple math for 10 years. I hope it goes much longer than that, but for simple math. So 250,000 times 10 would be 2.5 million. So when he dies, my state can come back to the first party special needs trust and say, well, he has gotten $2.5 million worth of support from us. So we want whatever's left in the first party trust to pay us back. If all that's left in that first party trust is $5,000, that's all they're going to get. They can't go after what's in the third party trust. Now, my son has a first party trust because he's going to get 55% of my pension when I die. So in some cases, if you're a military member, you can leave a portion of your retirement to your disabled child. If you are divorced, in many states now, you can pay child support beyond the age of 18, but that money has to go into a first party special needs trust. In cases of lawsuits like medical malpractice, the individual that was injured or harmed by the medical malpractice would need a first party special needs trust to get that money from the lawsuit. So those are some examples of why you would need a first party special needs trust. Generally speaking, I would expect that most of you attending this conference would not need, and would probably never need, if you plan properly, a first party special needs trust. I would imagine that most, if not all of you, can do just fine by setting up a third party special needs trust and then having loved ones and family members leave money that want to provide for the child, leave money to the third party trust, and it never has to go to a first party trust. So that's the difference between a first party and a third party trust. Both special needs trusts have been approved by Social Security to hold money, to hold assets. It doesn't have to be just money. It can be a house. It can be just about anything that you want. They can hold that, and it will not count as an asset towards the limits for any public benefits. And when I say public benefits, I don't just mean supplemental security income or Medicaid. It could be SSI, which is supplemental security income. It could be Medicaid. It could be housing vouchers. It could be supplemental nutrition assistance program, or SNAP, or what used to be called food stamps. All of those can be held inside, all of those have asset limits. Typically $2,000, but some states like Connecticut have lower asset limits. Connecticut, I think, is $1,600 is their asset limit. So you have to be careful how much money is in your child's name when they turn 18. A special needs trust, you could have $10 million in it, and none of that will count. So the states don't care how much is in the account. The only time they care is if your child is a first party special needs trust, and your child was getting Medicaid health insurance or Medicaid waiver services, and when the child dies, there's still money in that first party trust, and it has to be paid back to the state. I hope that makes sense. When I said you don't necessarily need an attorney to set up a special needs trust, that's because around the country, there are things called pooled trusts. And pooled trusts are run by nonprofits, and they are, by law, they're required to be managed by nonprofits, and they are professional trustees. So they have special needs trusts that have already been approved by Social Security. And instead of paying an attorney to set up your own trust, you would sign a joinder agreement and join the pooled trust. And inside the pooled trust, think about it like a big container, a big bin, like you would put a bunch of Christmas ornaments in. Inside that big bin, there's going to be a bunch of smaller bins. So maybe you have Christmas lights in one bin, and you have little plastic candy canes in another bin. So within that, so you have this big bin, and then you have smaller bins inside it. And the pool trust is very similar. It's a large organization, it's this just big entity. And within it, you have individual pools or individual trusts for the benefit of these different individuals. The reason it's called a pooled trust is because even though all that money is separate, the pooled trust is allowed to count all of it as if it were the same account and then invest it. So if instead of taking five $50,000 accounts and investing five $50,000 accounts into different investments, they can take the five $50,000 accounts and invest it as if it was $250,000, only at so take that at a bigger scale, and they get better. Typically they get lower fees for their investments because they're now they're doing, they're doing larger sums, so they can get lower fees for everybody. Whereas if you have smaller accounts, very often they don't give you discounts for those smaller accounts when you're investing with companies like BlackRock or Fidelity. So that's where one of the benefits of a pooled trust. The other benefit is they're professional trustees. So instead of setting up a trust with an attorney and then finding a trustee on your own, the pooled trust has professional trustees that's all they do. They're going to keep up with all the laws, and they'll do all of that for you. You don't have to keep track of that. And then, like I said, they're managed by a nonprofit, so you have two sets of eyes on it. You have the pooled trust staff who are looking at it, the trustees, and then you have the nonprofit board of directors who are making sure that the pooled trust staff are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So there's a second layer of protection. So, and that's where, if you don't want to use an attorney, or if you don't have a trustee, like I don't have a trustee. I don't have anybody that I can say, okay, when I'm gone, I have this person who I trust to make sure my son's trusts are being spent for him, and that I don't have to worry about if there's law change, the trustee is going to keep up with it. I don't have anybody I can trust. So I'm going to be using a pool trust to keep up with my son's trusts. So again, I'm hoping that makes sense. We're going to go into the elementary and middle years here. I am not an education expert. So instead of trying to explain what should be in an IEP, I just want to give you resources for organizations that you can tap into that can help you write a good IEP. That's not my skill set. You know, when you have a child with a disability, you do want to make sure that their IEP and or or if they have a 504 plan, that they're getting the resources that they're available for. That doesn't always mean you have to litigate. You know, very often you might be able to work better with an education advocate or an educational consultant instead of an education attorney. There's a national organization where you can find professionals near you that are certified by this organization. It is called the Council of Parents. It's COPAA. I'll send Bridget the link to it. It's called COPA, and I used to know what it stood for, but nobody uses the full acronym. Everybody uses the acronym, not the name. So it's called COPA, Charlie Oscar Papa Alpha Alpha. And that's where you can go if you're looking for an education advocate or attorney because you have questions or you want help working on your IEP or 504 plan. You know, there's also what's called rights law. There's training that you can get in your state through right to learn about how to be a better advocate, and that can be done through rights law, WRIGHT LAW, and they have a newsletter you can sign up for and things like that. And those are two very good resources that if you're interested in, if you have a child who's in school, maybe they just started school, or you've been having challenges, those are two really good resources for you that are they're national resources. It doesn't matter where you live, that you can tap into. I would encourage you to be careful. I want to talk about some mistakes I've seen parents make. The biggest one is having parents take their child out of the school and do a private placement without having the school agree to it. So this one case that sticks out is this parent had been fighting with the school for a very long time, I think 2 or 3 years, and wasn't really getting anywhere. So she did what I think any reasonable person would do and just said, you know what, I can't keep doing this, and took her child out of school and put them into a private school. The problem was the private school was about $50,000-$60,000 a year. And because they never got the public school system to agree, it had to come out of that parent's pocket. If you get the school to admit that the child cannot be served by the public school curriculum, then you can get what's called a non-public placement, and the school district will be required to pay for the private school. It's very hard to do because private schools can be very expensive, but it's possible. If you don't go that route and you decide to pay for private school out of pocket, two things to keep in mind. Number one, some private schools may not have to follow the same rules that public schools do with regards to following an IEP or 504. Number two, if your child is going to a school specifically because they are dyslexic, they have dyscalculia, or it's the school is some other way tied to their disability. That tuition can be deducted as a medical expense when you itemize, if you're itemizing your taxes. So that $60,000 a year tuition I was talking about, that could be a qualified medical expense in the eyes of the IRS, as long as it's tied to the child's disability. You know, you're not doing it because you don't like the school district. You're doing it because, you know, the nature of your child's learning disabilities make it so that they can't be served in the public school environment. You cannot get a private placement, and now you're paying out of pocket for this other school. My preference would be to have the public school do a non-public placement, but that's not the world we live in. I mean, the world we live in is, it's very difficult to do that. It can be exhausting, especially when parents like us, we're already dealing with a lot. We just don't want to fight, or we don't have it in us to fight. So if you decide to go the route of taking the child out of school and paying and putting them into a private school, again, the school would have to be related to the disability. There are schools out there that focus on helping students with behavior issues, with dyslexia, dyscalculia, other learning disabilities. Not so much if you're taking them out to put them into a religious school, or, you know, or something like that. Again, I would encourage you to talk to a tax professional before you just itemize it, because you really want to make sure that you do this right. But it is another option that I see overlooked far too often in this world of families who have children with disabilities. And I'd really like to see more people try to take advantage of that. So list funding, I apologize. I thought I took that off. That is Maryland. That is Maryland only. However, other states may have scholarships or grants for children with disabilities that you might be able to tap into. A lot of every state has a Department of Assistive Technology. So if your child needs to use assistive technology, very often you can get a technology grant or a low to zero interest loan from the state to get the technology. You may be able to get loaner technology while you're waiting for insurance to cover what you need. Again, and it's from what I've seen, it's very often an unused resource. So if you have a child who needs assistive technology, not just iPads, it could be really anything, look into what's available at your state. I don't want parents getting too wrapped up into their child's disability. Try to remember that your child is still a child, and they have they may have other hobbies and interests, or try to get them involved in things. Speaking for myself, it can be very hard, especially if you have a medically complex child, or if you have a child with a lot going on. It can be hard not just seeing the diagnosis. So I think I put this on here probably to remind myself as much as to remind everybody else. When they're in middle school, you can start having a conversation about when is your child going to leave school. When you have a child with a disability, they can stay in school until 21, 22 years old, 26 if you live in Michigan. They don't have to leave school at age 18. But if they leave school at 21, 22, or 26 in Michigan, they're in what's called a certificate program. So instead of graduating with a diploma, they're graduating with they're leaving high school with a certificate. That certificate should give them all the same abilities as that a diploma would. If they want to go to college, if they want to go to a trade school, you know, that certificate should allow them to do all of those things. Don't feel pressured to get your kid out of school at age 18, especially if they're going to need supports into their adult lives. Because in just about every state I've looked at, California being the outlier, it is very, very difficult to get an adult supports if they don't get signed up for those supports while they're in high school, and then leave school right after, at 21, 22. In most cases, the states will not start supporting children with disabilities until they're 21, 22 years old. It's not a guarantee that if you leave your child in school until 21, 22, that they're going to get some services right away. There's no guarantee of that. The waiting lists in these states are so incredibly long, you could still be waiting 5 to 10 years for Medicaid supports. So what can and let me back up a second, because I don't think I covered what is available for Medicaid. I mean, how is my son on a $250,000 a year budget? Let me make sure I cover that. Every state in the country has at least one Medicaid waiver for individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. Those waivers, generally speaking, are all going to cover the same types of things. They're going to cover residential supports, which is making sure the individual has a place to live. It could be a group home where they're living with four to six other roommates. It could be an apartment where they're living by themselves. It could be your house where they're providing staff to to support your child. And that the goal is to have your child live independently. This is not for minor children. This is for adults. The second support is what's called personal supports. Personal supports are all the things that we do to live our day-to-day lives. It's brushing teeth, it's showering, it's buying groceries, cleaning the house, mowing the yard, all of those things. If you're on a residential waiver, or if you're getting residential supports through a waiver, you're not going to get personal supports, because the residential supports will encompass the personal supports. So you will never get personnel supports and residential supports at the same time. There's vocational support, and there's two different ways you can get vocational support. There's vocational support through the Medicaid waiver, which is find a job, keep a job, could be transportation to and from work, could be a job coach, could be any other accommodations you need. All that would be paid for by the Medicaid waiver. The other type of vocational support you could get would be through your state's Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. It might be called something different in your state. Every state has one, but they all call it different things. Again, these will all be broken out in the roadmaps I'm going to send to Bridget so she can farm them out to you based on where you live. But it spells all this out for you, where to apply. So vocational supports, again, and you can get both at the same time. You can be getting support from Voc Rehab. In a perfect world, that's what'll happen is you'll start with Voc Rehab in what's called pre-employment transition services, PREETs, because that can start when your child is 14. I think Rhode Island is 16, but generally speaking, it's 14. And then it shifts over to VR or Voc Rehab at 18. And then it's from there, it's a handoff to the vocational supports to the Medicaid waiver, because Voc Rehab and pre-employment transition services, they're meant to be short-term solutions. They're meant to be, we're going to provide support for 4 to 6 weeks, just get somebody up and running, and then we're going to gradually, like when you're teaching somebody to ride a bike, you've got the person on training wheels, and then gradually they take the training wheels off and they're off by themselves. That would be Voc Rehab. Vocational support from the Medicaid waiver would be having somebody run alongside you while you're riding your bike everywhere you go to make sure you don't fall off, or if you do fall off, you don't get hurt too bad. So that's vocational support. The last type of Medicaid waiver support you can get is what's called meaningful day or community supports. They're called different things, but they mean the same thing. For individuals who cannot work an 8-hour day, they don't want people in the house all day long. They want people out and about. So meaningful day or community supports, whatever it's called in your state, is meant to get people out and about, to help them find hobbies, to make friends. Maybe they're doing some volunteering. And when I say the waiver is paying for this, what it's doing is it's paying for the staff of the individuals providing the support to the person with the disability. And you have the option of self-directing all of this. So instead of working with an agency, you could self-direct it. So I tried self-direction. What that means is you are given a budget, and you are allowed to hire your own staff. Medicaid will say you have a maximum amount that you can pay and a minimum amount you can pay. Let's say for non-medical caregiving, meaning that it's not nursing care, it's just, let's say it's just somebody to help with the personal supports, brushing teeth and all that. Let's say the maximum you can pay somebody is $20 an hour, and the minimum would be $12 an hour. So if you're doing your own budget, you could say, well, I'm going to offer $14 an hour. And then you would just make sure you would keep track of how many people you're hiring, and you would turn the budget in every month. You would just make sure you were doing it. It's very labor intensive, because if somebody calls out, it's on you. The interviewing process is on you. Finding staff is on you. The background check is going to be done by the state, so you don't have to worry about that. But it's very, very labor intensive. It didn't work for me and my son. It just didn't. So instead, we went back to using an agency. And the agency, an example would be, because every state has these, could be your local ARC chapter. Very often, ARC chapters around the country will provide residential supports, vocational supports, personal supports, meaningful day supports. There's other organizations that do it. I'm just using the ARC because the ARC is a national organization with chapters in every state, and I think it's easily recognizable. So that is the Medicaid waiver. You want to apply for that as soon as you get your diagnosis, or your child gets their diagnosis. The states that don't have any supports for children under the age of 18 will put you on a waiting list, and they'll say, okay, well, there's nothing we can do for you right now. But you still want to get on that waiting list. You want to be on their radar, because if anything happens to you, you want to be able to, or maybe your child's symptoms progress, you want to be able to ask them for help. I'm not going to promise that they're going to do anything for you. Sadly, there are cases where people are just really struggling, and the state isn't doing anything to help. But the more they know about you, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to step in if something happens. So the psych eval, I don't touch on too much. I just remember when my son was going through, he got a couple different psych evals while he was going through school. A lot of it was probably to make sure the diagnosis was the same. And then he did one with voc rehab. So I'm gonna jump into the next one. I know I'm dumping a lot of stuff on you guys, so if you have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in chat, and I'll make sure I give time to answer them afterwards. Transition planning should start when your child turns 14. Again, different states will do it at different times, but really it should start at age 14. And that is when we start talking about certificate or diploma, that you could start having voc rehab come to the IEP meetings to work with the IEP team on goals. and maybe over the summer help the child get a job. You could have, um, you really want to start interviewing if you're going to go the agency route, or you're not sure if you're going to go the agency route or not. You want to start interviewing agencies around you and seeing what they're like. Talk to other parents who are a little bit further along than you are to see who they like. Facebook groups can be really helpful. It's important to not wait until your child's 18 to start trying to do this. You really want to start trying at 14, 15 years old. Even if your child's not going to be able to drive, you're going to want to make sure they get a state ID. My son will never drive, but I did get him a state ID. It's a good thing to have, especially if there's a chance that they might elope or run off. I've talked about voc rehab. I don't know I don't know how NR2F1, I don't know how BBOAS, I don't know, I'm not sure how it typically manifests. My son is on the spectrum. He gets violent. He has outbursts. So he has been brought home by the police before. And it was that, even though I talk about interviewing and making sure that your local police department knows about your child, I didn't actually talk to dispatch or tell them that, I have somebody living with me who screams and throws things and maybe neighbors will complain until the police had brought him home. You want to try to be a little more proactive than I was. Again, just to make sure that if your child runs, you want to make sure that the police know this is something to look out for. If he's out in the community or she's out in the community and people are complaining because they're acting weird, it's not drugs, it's just, the disability. You just want to make sure that they're aware of your child. That's what I mean when I say introduce to law enforcement. The way I did it was I called the non-emergency number and I talked to dispatch and they asked me a couple things about what's the nature of the disability, what types of things does he like, how does he respond when he's approached, and those were the kinds of things they asked me. I don't know what your experience will be like, but I do believe more and more law enforcement agencies are doing their best to make sure that interactions that law enforcement has with individuals with disabilities are positive. Obviously not everyone everywhere, but I do feel like they're trying to get better. With regards to college planning, more and more colleges are offering non-credit courses to help students who would like to learn more life skills, who are trying to, or maybe they take a longer time to launch. I want to caution you about if you're applying for Medicaid waiver supports or if you're applying for Social Security, supplemental security income. I want to be very clear that if your child is going to college, regardless of how much support you're giving them to help them be successful, the perception is going to be that they probably don't need state level support from a Medicaid waiver. Right, wrong, or indifferent, that is just what I've seen across the country. And I'm not trying to say don't let your child go to college. I want to manage expectations that if you have a child going to college, you are probably going to be facing an uphill battle with regards to getting support from the state or getting Social Security. Both of those things are really designed to help individuals with significant disabilities, and this is Eric's opinion, they're not set up to acknowledge the complicated reality we as parents have, right? Where our children may be better at academics than they would be in a work environment, or they just feel safer in a classroom than they do in a, than they do in a job or a social environment. And so somebody could have some very profound disabilities or profoundly affected by their disability and do okay in an online class. Doesn't mean they're not disabled. Um, Unfortunately, that's a little too nuanced for a lot of the states and Social Security. So just know that if you have an individual with disabilities who wants to go to college and you want to get them support from the state or from Social Security, maybe what you do is you apply for benefits first, get the supports in place, and then look into the college. Um, I'm not sure. I don't have a magic bullet. I really want to manage expectations and make sure you know what to expect. So oftentimes I hear people talk about the cliff that happens after age 18 or after high school. I already talked about if you, many cases, if you leave school at 18, you could be up a creek and not get any support. So you're going to be private paying for services, out of pocket. That, number one, is very expensive. Number two, it can be hard finding somebody to provide those supports. It can be very, very difficult. There's a shortage of caregivers out there right now, and it's hard. It's a very hard thing. So just be aware of it. Apply for SSI. You can apply for SSI on behalf of your child the first day of the month that they turn 18. So we're in April right now. If you have a child whose birthday is May 25th, you can apply on May 1st. You want to document everything and you want to give Social Security copies of everything that show that your child is impacted by a disability, not just whatever their diagnosis is. If they have anxiety, if they're depressed, if you want to show how everything is impacting your child, not just their primary diagnosis. When I submitted for Social Security for my son, I included copies of all the IEPs. I included the psych evals that the schools did. I included Voc Rehab's report. I included everything. I also worked with an attorney. You don't have to work with an attorney. You can absolutely file everything on your own and work with Social Security on your own. I found it to be exhausting, so I chose not to. Because I told you I wanted to give you concrete resources, another resource available to you guys is called NOSSER, National Organization of Social Security Claimant Representatives. I'm going to send Bridget a link, so I'm not, don't worry about trying to write all this down. They have a referral line. It's an 800 number you can call and get referred to somebody in your state that can help you file a claim for Social Security for your child. The way they get paid typically is they will take 25% of the first check. And the reason they do that is because that first check is all the back pay. It can take anywhere between 6 months to a year or longer to get approved for SSI. So when you are approved, you get all that money paid to you, all that back pay paid to you in a lump sum. And then if you hire a representative or an attorney like I did, they're going to get 25%. So let's say that first check is $12,000 because of all the back pay. I'm doing this for made up numbers for math reasons. I need easy numbers that I can use. Then the attorney would get $3,000 from that first check. And then you would never pay the attorney again. And you would have the remaining $9,000 for the child with a disability. To make things easier, it's never going to be easy when you're applying for Social Security, but to further your case along, it helps to tell Social Security, it helps to be charging your child rent or room and board. The difference between rent and room and board, as I understand it, is you don't have to pay taxes on room and board. You're supposed to pay taxes on rent. I don't know. I'm not an accountant. This is what was conveyed to me. Either way, you want your child paying their in air quotes, fair share of the rent. So if you live in a house with a mortgage of $2,000 and there's 4 of you living there, your child should be paying $500 a month in Social Security's eyes. Not a guarantee that your child is going to get the full Social Security benefit. In 2024, the full SSI amount is $943 a month. Very often what will happen is if the child is living with you, Social Security is going to reduce that benefit by 1/3. I don't know the math on that. It works out to be a little over $600 a month. And that's because they feel you're providing what's called in-kind support and maintenance. You're giving them a place to live. So they're not going to give the child the full SSI amount. In most states, not every state, in most states, as soon as you're approved for SSI, you are going to get enrolled in Medicaid. That will typically happen automatically. It's not available in every state. Again, it'll be broken out in the roadmap that you're going to get, whether or not your state gets this, because I've tried to make these roadmaps to be as useful as possible. So you'll know when you get your roadmap whether or not your child would get Medicaid automatically. Some states like New York and California also have a supplemental security payment, which is an additional payment over and above what you're getting from SSI, and you're getting that from the state. I feel it's very important to apply for SSI before the child turns 22, because if you do, and they remain disabled for the rest of their life, they may be eligible for what's called Disabled Adult Child Benefit, DAC. And Disabled Adult Child Benefit means that when you either become disabled or retire, your child will get 50% of what you're getting from Social Security, and your child would get it in the form of SSDI instead of SSI. So if you're getting $2,000 a month from Social Security, your child is going to get $1,000 a month. And they'll probably not get any SSI anymore, because SSI will be reduced dollar for dollar. For every dollar of SSDI he's getting or she's getting, SSI will be reduced by $1. But SSDI is better. For one thing, it doesn't have the asset cap. If your child is on Social Security disability insurance, the state doesn't care how much money they have in their name. They'll still be eligible for Medicaid, so you still have to keep within the asset cap for Medicaid. And 24 months after they start receiving SSDI, they'll automatically be enrolled in Medicare. So your child could have Medicaid, Medicare, private health insurance, maybe, SSDI. So there's a lot out there for your child as they get older. When you die, your child would get 75% of your Social Security benefit for the rest of their life. Again, assuming they qualify for Disabled Adult Child Benefit. To qualify for Disabled Adult Child Benefit, they have to be disabled before they're 24, I think. Don't quote me on the age, but they have to be disabled before a certain age, and it's young, to receive the DAC. If you have a child who is born male, you're going to want to make sure they enroll in selective service, even if your child is profoundly affected by their disabilities. And that's because there's a lot of things, a lot of states and federal employment hinge on being enrolled in selective service, as does FAFSA. So if they ever want to go to college and get use the federal FAFSA, whatever FAFSA is, you have to have been signed up with selective service. I've talked about voc rehab. Guardianship versus supported decision making. This is a hot topic. I'm only going to give you a very high level view. I am my son's legal guardian. I opted to do that because my son is not at this time capable of making medical decisions for himself. And if I was his power of attorney or healthcare proxy, I can't override his medical choices. So if he says he doesn't want a procedure, then I can't say, yes, he does, give him the procedure. And there's a bunch of other more complicated reasons why I went for guardianship. to get guardianship, you have to prove somebody is legally incompetent. So you're going to go before a judge. Your child is going to have an attorney appointed over them, and you and your child are going to go to court, and the judge is going to determine if the child is legally incompetent. The alternative to that is supported decision making, where you have a team of people who help your child make decisions. Some states are codifying that. They have laws. They have put it into the legislature what their supported decision making process looks like. So it's going to depend on where you live. Looking at the time, so housing is very, very difficult in every state. When you're thinking about where your child is going to live, this is something you need to take into account. If you go the residential route through the Medicaid waiver, they're always going to have a place to live. It just may not be the same type of lifestyle you want them to have. Meaning, if they're living with 3 or 4 other roommates, how much choice around food and stuff are they going to have? Or if they're in an apartment, they have, and they're living by themselves, they have more freedom. If you want to leave them the house, your house, and you want to have staff come in, who's going to keep up with the cleaning of the house? Who's going to keep up with the maintenance of the house? These are kinds of things you need to be thinking about for the housing. And then I've talked a lot about employment. I've talked about agency or self-directed. So I think that covers everything I wanted to make sure I talked about today. I'm not going to leave I changed companies. I'm no longer with True North Disability Planning. I've merged my company with Visible, but Bridget has my contact info. Bridget, do we have time for any questions? Are there any questions?
Do you guys have any questions? Do you have one?
Just a quick one, sorry. What's the best state if someone wants to move to a best state for disability point of view? Which state would you recommend?
That's really difficult to say. The states I've found to have the best success rate, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, California, but it depends what regional center you get. States to avoid are going to be Florida, Texas. Really, most of the southern states are pretty brutal with regards to getting support. Tennessee's pretty good. They're very, very lean. They're very forward leaning with technology, but I can't say definitively this is going to be the one for you because it really depends what your child needs.
That's helpful, thank you.
So you're going to send me the resources and then I can share it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.